Hello and welcome. Is the English language actually destroying the world's diversity rather than uniting it? The term GLOBISH has been coined to describe how a global version of English has grown in popularity, and it makes people ask whether the widespread use of English is hurting the linguistic cultures of countries or promoting multinational ties. Due largely to the economic, cultural and military dominance of Britain and the United States, English has become the world's language when it comes to conducting international business and diplomacy. There are an estimated 328 million native English speakers and as many as 1 billion people around the world learning it as a second language. But at what price to their native language and cultural roots? On today's show we ask, is the worldwide spread of English promoting global understanding, or is it simply linguistic imperialism? You can join our conversation by calling into the show or by sending us an SMS or an email. Now, joining me now for the discussion is journalist and author Robert McCrum, who's, in addition to co-authoring the international bestseller, The Story of English, has just written GLOBISH, How the English Language Became the World's Language. He's in London. And in Copenhagen we have Robert PHILLIPSON, a linguist and professor emeritus at the Copenhagen Business School. He's best known for his research which denounces linguistic imperialism and looks at the relationship between language and power. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Robert McCrum, if I could start with you there in London and just get a quick summary of what GLOBISH is. It's a term that I guess many people wouldn't have heard yet.
Well, GLOBISH is not my term. It was invented by a Frenchman, in fact, who was in Japan in the 1990s. And what he spotted when he was in Japan, he was a man called Monsieur Jean-Paul Nerrière. He spotted that when non-native speakers, Japanese speakers of English, used English in conversation, they did better conversationally with Koreans and Vietnamese and so forth, i.e. other non-native speakers, than they did with English or Americans. In other words, the non-native speakers do better when they have a slightly simplified version of the language than they do when they talk to somebody who has it where there's more nuance and more variety. And he coined the term GLOBISH, and I borrowed it.
Let me ask you what the difference is between
English language.
Yeah, well, what's the difference between GLOBISH and Pidgin English?
Well, a pidgin is the first generation of a contact language between peoples who are not who are communicating with each other, who don't share. So a pidgin will evolve in somewhere like the Caribbean, on the slave ships during the period of during the slave trade in the period of the Middle Passage, and a Creole is then a second generation pidgin. But a pidgin is much more. It's a contact language. It's much simplified. And what I'm talking about in GLOBISH is something which is more of a lingua franca.
Okay. Let me bring in Professor PHILLIPSON here. Sir, good to have you with us too there from Copenhagen, and ask, if everyone learned GLOBISH, wouldn't that knowledge have a democratizing effect on those who aren't already native speakers of English?
Well, I agree that the Frenchman who invented the term is right, that people often understand others who are using English as a foreign language more easily than native speakers. Native speakers make far fewer concessions to other users of English. But this doesn't mean that the kind of approach that he has to learning the language is relevant for learners of the language. In other words, there's no quick fix to learning English. If English is a school subject, if it's used in higher education, in universities, then what people need to have is competence which is related to the diversity of English when it's used by Americans, by Australians, by South Africans, by Indians. They need to be able to understand the diversity of types of English, whereas in terms of what they need to produce, they need English which can express their own cultural identity and their own specific needs. And the needs of the business community, which this French guy was particularly focusing on, are very limited by comparison with what general education does.
Okay, well, Robert McCrum, we had an email, if I may put to you, from Bangladesh, where our viewers write in, as you know, from around the world. Mishal Ahmed wrote in saying, English does not pose any threat to the cultures or mother tongue of the countries it infiltrates, unless those countries choose to give it away. How much power does a country have to stop the onslaught of English, in your opinion, Robert?
Well, I mean, obviously, a country like France, for example, they've become very defensive about the spread of English within French culture. But I must say I agree with the gentleman from Bangladesh. Mother tongues are very, very powerful, far more powerful than, I mean, GLOBISH English it's an ersatz. It's a very ephemeral. It's very limited, as Dr. PHILLIPSON has pointed out. It has a very limited role, and I think we should also at this point draw a distinction between the written and the spoken.